Good evening, everyone. Together with Dr. Marta Kuczarnecka and Dr. Andrzej Karalus, we welcome you on another Rethinking Economics Gdańsk seminar. We are affiliated with the Faculty of Management in Economics in Gdańsk University of Technology. We are supported also by Edward Lipinski Foundation. Central banking is really complicated issue for the most people. Institutional intricacies arising from given theoretical regime render that leading of monetary policy has been transmitted into a group of experts, ensuring them huge independence. That was due to belief in neutrality of the monetary policy for the income distribution. COVID-19 crisis has clearly shown that monetary policy and cooperation of central bank with the government is crucial. Furthermore, since certain time it's obvious that monetary policy is not neutral concerning distribution of income because interest rate determines income of a given class. Now we can also observe the impact of unconventional monetary policy, it is QE, that has been applied since the global financial crisis on the wealth inequalities in the society. Questions concerning neutrality of monetary policy should be posed and rethink again. Today we have distinguished guest in the issue of central banking and money, Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon from Laurentian University. It is impossible to enumerate all of his influential books and positions, so I only show the series of his last 5 books concerning central banking. Louis-Philippe Rochon, thank you, and the floor is yours. I will change pictures for you, so give me a sign every time.
I will, thank you. If you can start sharing now. So I couldn't share my presentation, so we have to do it this way, and I'm just waiting for it. So while I'm waiting, so my name is Louis-Philippe Rochon. I am a full professor of economics at Laurentian University, and I got my PhD at the New School for Social Research in New York, which is a very important institution in the history of heterodox economics. I am the founding editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics, which is in its 10th year now, and I'm currently the editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy. I've also been the consulting editor for a new journal called the Advances in Economics Education, which will be a journal that will specialize in teaching economics, I guess. And I'll have a paper in that first issue on pre-COVID, post-Keynesian economics, post-COVID, something like that. Is my presentation up?
Marta, can you see the presentation?
Yes, but please make it full screen.
Okay, I will try. Is it okay right now?
Yep.
Okay.
So, so this first slide, this is a picture that I took in Paris, and I thought it was so appropriate. As you can see, it is a homeless person sleeping underneath this graffiti, I guess. What I thought was this eagle, this symbol of power, with sort of a monopoly guy, with a top hat and glasses. And for me, that screams, the capitalist who's abusing the workers. You can see the workers are sort of afraid and crouching beneath him, and then there's a homeless man underneath. I thought it was just a very great symbol of so much of the struggle that we have to go through. Next slide. So today's presentation is really sort of a culmination of more than 20 years of my research, and it won't be specifically on a paper, but go over sort of what I've been, the development of my ideas on monetary policy in the last 2 decades. And there is definitely an economic component to it, but the criticism comes from a political economy and also a little bit of a philosophy, a little bit of sociology, all mixed in for good measure. And my views have been greatly influenced by, you know, John Maynard Keynes to a degree, less so today, but certainly by Michael Kalecki and some great economists like Joan Robinson, Thorsten Veblen, Carl Polanyi, and Susan Strange. Next slide, please. And so in that sense, in the last couple of years, I've been really struggling with a lot of ideas around central banking. And I thought much of monetary policy from the mainstream perspective is just very mechanical. You know, you have a little bit of inflation, you raise interest rates. You hope the economy slows down, you bring inflation back down to target. Just very dry, very mechanical. And the more you think about it and the more you research it and the more you look into things, the more you scratch the surface, you realize that the issues are a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more going on. And so this is sort of where my thinking is at, trying to scratch beneath the surface. And in that sense, I hosted a conference a few years ago in France on the future of central banking, and that was sort of meant to be one book. And in that book, you know, we had a couple of chapters on the environment and gender and income distribution. But it sort of became very obvious very quickly that there was really a need to create a whole series of books around the theme of central banking and monetary policy, and to really explore in detail many issues surrounding monetary policy. And while the first book is on the future of central banking, we've subsequently did a book specifically on monetary policy and income distribution, and another book on monetary policy and the environment, and another book on central banking and democracy or social responsibility. You know, if central banks are said to be independent, what is the relationship between central bank independence and the values that we hold so dear in a democracy? Especially if, as I'll talk about today, some of the impact of monetary policy are long-lasting. So we have a bunch of technocrats making decisions on interest rates that have long-lasting effects, especially on workers and on women and on indigenous peoples. And so what does that mean in terms of the responsibility of central bankers towards the greater society? And finally, we have a book on the future of money, which is a book on monetary policy, central banking, and parallel monies and electronic monies, and what does that all mean for monetary policy? Next slide, please. And then we have 3 more books in currently. Those 5 books have already sort of been submitted, and they're coming out later this year. And we're working on 3 other books now, which is one on central banking, monetary policy, and gender. And to be clear, there has never been a book on this topic. There's never been a symposium on this topic. This is the first time that this topic will be fully aired. There's been some articles here and there, but never really sort of a focused attention on this topic. We're having one on financial stability. One of the questions I've always had is whether low interest rates cause financial bubbles. And I always rejected that. I never thought that was the case. Rather, I think that the cause of financial bubbles is the lack of regulations about lending, about investments, about stock markets. And so this book will explore that in more details. And finally, this book that I'm trying to put together on central banking at the intersection of society, which is that we need to embed central banks, monetary policy within the context of a greater society. And this is really sort of inspired by work of Veblen, who speaks about the vested interest versus the common interests, and Polanyi. And so we have to consider central banks as institutions of power and how that power is exercised. Again, parallels with issues of democracy. Next slide, please. And finally, all of this is part of activities of an institute that I've created with some colleagues called the Monetary Policy Institute. And in that context, we have books on central banks and Latin America coming out later this year, and a book on central banking and Africa coming out again also this year, and a bunch of other sort of projects, a book on the future of the European Central Bank. So this is really interesting work that's being done. I'm heading up a research project on monetary policy and income distribution, and we're going to have a conference on that. And I'm presently in the midst of organizing a second conference in Italy with the Central Bank of Italy and the European Central Bank on central banks, financial markets, and income distribution. So that's going to be in May of 2023. So there'll be lots of, a call for paper will be coming out later, soon enough. Next slide. So we come to this presentation today after a very long and boring, I'm sure, introduction. And there's going to be two parts to what I want to talk about today. And the first is, I do want to talk about the mainstream view in order to set it up so we can tear it down. And, you know, this mainstream view is, you know, is in the process of changing a little bit. And that's the result, I believe, of confusion within the mainstream about monetary policy. I think there's a lot of question marks within the greater community about central banking and what exactly it does. If you look at the evolution of the research in a lot of the central banks, you'll know that a lot of them have started to embrace the concept of endogenous money or exogenous interest rates, which is something post-Keynesians have been talking about at least since 1970, I would say even back in the mid-50s with Joan Robinson. But they're sort of embracing that. They're doing a lot of research on income distribution right now since the great financial crisis. They're starting to work on gender. So I think this is because they don't quite know, you know, the monetary policy used to be easy. As I said, you got inflation, you raise interest rates, and you got a target and you try to hit it. But I think that since the twin crises, things are a little bit murkier. You now have talk of dual mandates. You have talk about flexible inflation targeting. So I think there's some muddiness in central banking right now. And I think this is a great opportunity to sort of come in and try to influence a little bit of the debate. And this is what I'm hoping will happen with this conference in Italy, which is really going to be a conference where I think 90% of the participants will be very mainstream. But I hope that by having a little 10% presence of heterodox people, will be able to, hopefully create a dialogue. This is what I'm really hoping. So this mainstream view sort of goes back to Woodford, 1993, Taylor with his Taylor rule. And I mean, while there's some murkiness, there's still, a lot of belief in, the importance of the Phillips curve and the IS curve and the Taylor rule. And maybe inflation targeting is becoming more flexible, but it's sort of, working on the edges of the model. The model itself remains very much, I think, intact. And in one of the books that's coming out this year on central banking, I have a paper called The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy, in which, by ineffectiveness, I mean from the mainstream perspective, that the idea of an inflation target and using interest rates in order to achieve that target is kind of ineffective. And I go through the reasons why, and I've identified several arguments that I deal with. And I'll briefly talk about these today. But, there's the question of the inflation target itself, 2%. Why 2%? Why not 3? Why not 4? The IS curve. Is there really an IS curve? Is there that statistical or empirical relationship in the data? Can we see it? The Phillips curve. Is there a Phillips curve? I'll, leave aside the question of whether there was there ever a Phillips curve? But I'll deal with the statistical relationship of the Phillips curve today, the concept of the natural rate, which is part of the model. The issue of fine-tuning, of using monetary policy, interest rates. You raise them a little bit, you lower them a little bit, you raise them, you raise them, you raise them, you lower them. If any of you have a radio, probably not, but your grandparents have a radio where you have to turn the knob to exactly get that, radio station. That's what fine-tuning is, you just sort of tweak interest rates until you finally get it right. The concept of demand pull inflation, this model indisputably has to deal only with inflation if it's caused by excess demand. That's what the IS curve. You raise your interest rates, you hope it's going to affect your consumption and your investment. These are parts of demand. But what if inflation is more or predominantly a supply side condition? Can monetary policy affect supply side inflation? Big question. And if it cannot, then the entire model just falls apart. And in fact, this is what's going to happen. Bit by bit, you're going to see that every single of these elements completely fall apart, which at the end, there's nothing left. Hence the general ineffectiveness. And we can add to that central bank independence and the long run neutrality of policy. And I think, as I mentioned, there's a general misunderstanding of the inflation process. And in the end, even though nothing's left of the model, the practice or the art of central banking, right, still exists. And central bankers still operate as if all of these elements are still standing. And so in the end, what central banks really are doing is they're weaponizing inflation. They're using inflation as a weapon. They still believe that central monetary policy can work, And so they crank up interest rates. And it's not really fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is sort of, I'm sorry, I'm just jotting down notes as they pop up in my head. Fine-tuning is just the wrong expression, really, because central banks don't raise interest rates lower, raise lower, raise lower. They raise and raise and raise and raise and raise and raise and raise until finally the economy collapses. And this is the weaponization of investment. And if you look at past, business cycles, and you look at what, central banks have done, you see, maybe not as much in the last 10 years, of course, because monetary policy has been sort of stuck at the lower bound. But, going back 30 years, you can see these increases in interest rates, repeated increases in interest rates. And this is the weaponization, what John Smith called the revenge of the rentier. And so they do that, and I was going to say Charles Dickens. Ed Dickens, the great economist in the United States, calls this the monetary propaganda of central banks. And yeah, they're using propaganda. They're using this, and because people don't quite understand the subtleties, the subtleties. Or the intricate ideas around monetary policy and around central banking. They go along for the ride. There are these ideas that are so embedded in people's consciousness. The idea that deficits are bad. The idea that inflation is bad. When most workers probably benefit from inflation. Right? A little bit of inflation lowers the value of your debt. And workers, 90% of workers are in debt. But still, they think it's bad. They think that if the price of bread goes up by 5% from $1 to $1.05, that's a horrible thing. When in reality, most people can probably live with a little bit of inflation. But anyways. And so what happens is that this weaponization comes precisely from the fact that central banks have been captured by vested interests. And they are there to defend the interests of the financial class. Central banks are not there to defend the workers. Otherwise, they would keep interest rates low, and in order to create investments and in order to create, jobs which would benefit workers. But no, they're focused on inflation. And there's this great quote by Jerry Epstein in the encyclopedia that I did on central banking in 2016. It's about a 3-4 page entry, and it's really great. Where central banks are independent of the executive branch of government, they tend to be dependent on the financial sector for political support, and therefore tend to make policy with finance-colored glasses. Okay, this is sort of going to be a theme running through this presentation. Next slide, please, on inflation targeting. So, I've listed those elements that I want to sort of deconstruct and tear down. And the first is just the concept of inflation targeting, which is something that happened in 1990 in New Zealand, 1991 in Canada, and has spread around the world. And in most cases, countries around the world have adopted a 2% target, or maybe a corridor between 1 and 3, but on average a 2%. And we never knew why. We never knew why 2% was adopted. Why not 3? Why not 4? And if we had adopted 4%, we would be having a very different conversation today, post-COVID or mid-COVID, about inflation. You know, you have inflation sort of going up around the world, and a number of central banks have started raising interest rates in order to fight inflation. But if we had had a 4% or 5% target, we wouldn't be having the conversation about raising rates right now. So that target is very important. Where does it come from? Well, it turns out we don't know. There's this great quote by Benjamin Friedman of Harvard, in which this was in a Festschrift in honor of Victor Constancio, and he says, there's this arbitrariness, right? It's arbitrary. The arbitrariness surrounding the current 2% target. In retrospect, the paucity, which means the lack of, the paucity of serious empirical research underlying the identification of the 2% norm, now quite some time back, is a professional embarrassment. You just can't write something more damaging. Friedman is saying that economists fell asleep at the switch. We just arbitrarily, his word, not mine, arbitrarily adopted a 2% interest rate without ever justifying it. That's a pretty serious accusation. Next slide, please. So monetary policy is based on inflation being the result of excess demand. And in that sense, in order to hit your inflation target, whenever inflation is above target, you raise interest rates and you hope that consumption and investment will come down. That's an empirical question. And if you look in the data, you see that it's just not there. Now, let's be clear. I think that when economists are saying it's not in the data, what they're saying is you don't see consumption and investment responding statistically significantly to incremental changes in interest rates. If you raise your interest rate from 0.25 to 0.50, you probably won't get much. You probably won't get anything from 0.5 to 0.75, then from 0.75 to 1. These small incremental changes, you probably won't get the response from consumption and investment that you're looking for, described by that, sort of, you want that elastic, because you want that range of influence, that elastic Phillips curve. You just don't get that. Now, monetary policy is sort of a blunt instrument. So if you raise that interest rate significantly, in that pursuit of what I call the holy grail, which is your neutral or your natural rate of interest, then you're going to collapse your economy, and then you will find that empirical relationship, but not from one incremental change to another. And so this is a great quote by Barry Cinnamon, Stephen Fazzari, and Mark Setterfield, in which they say the transmission mechanism for monetary policy to aggregate spending relies on the interest sensitivity of consumption. It's difficult to find empirical evidence that a household do indeed raise or lower consumption by a significant amount when interest rates change. And they say, even when it comes to investment, you just don't find it in the data. Krugman called this the dirty little secret of monetary analysis, that any direct effect on business investment is so small that it's hard to even see it in the data. So, you don't have that IS curve. Already, that's a problem for monetary policy. Next slide, please. Because what you want is you raise your interest rate, you lower consumption, you raise your unemployment, and you bring down inflation through the Phillips curve. Well, the Phillips curve is part of a lot of controversy in the last 20 years or so. And the statistical relationship, again, these are empirical questions, just doesn't seem to be there anymore. Claudio Borio, who's one of my favorite mainstream economists from the BIS, the response of inflation to a measure of labor market slack has tended to decline and become statistically indistinguishable from zero. In other words, the slope of the Phillips curve is completely flat, or you have a very important portion of your Phillips curve that is flat. Okay, Bob Solow. This is an article of Bob's that I published in the Review of Keynesian Economics in 2018. It was a full article on Milton Friedman, 50th anniversary of Friedman's presidential American Economic Association talk. He says the slope of the Phillips curve itself has been getting flatter ever since the 1980s and is now quite small. There's no well-defined natural rate of unemployment, either statistically or conceptually. Damaging. If you don't have a Phillips curve, if you don't have an IS curve, what the hell are you doing if you're a central banker? Even the concept of the natural rate of interest, we know this. The natural rate is an abstract, unobservable, model-dependent concept. I've asked central bankers, what's your natural rate? And they say, we don't know what it is. But if there's inflation, we know that interest rates are below the natural rate. So that's how they know to raise interest rates. Because there's inflation, there must be interest rates that are lower than what they should be. Sorry, that was the slide on natural rate of interest, sorry. And then the next slide on fine tuning. I kind of talked about this already. And so all of that, what I can say is that if you don't have a Phillips curve, if you don't have an IS curve, if you know your natural rate is unobservable, if you know all of that, well, what's left? Next slide, please. And so the conclusion to this economic view is, this is a great quote by Phil Orestes and Malcolm. It is a long and uncertain chain of events from an adjustment in the interest rate controlled by the central bank to a desired change in the rate of inflation. Absolutely. It's an uncertain chain of events, especially if you don't have a well-established, statistically stable IS curve and Phillips curve. Keynes has this expression about there's a lot of sips to the cup, something like that. And this quote kind of like picks up on that. And this was sort of the conclusion of the 2017 Peterson Institute on Rethinking Macroeconomic Policy, which was chaired by Summers and Blanchard. And, the conclusion was, without the Phillips curve, the whole complicated paraphernalia that underpins central bank policy suddenly looks very shaky. And for that reason, the Phillips curve won't be abandoned lightly by policymakers. And that's right. There are, lots of papers trying to, search for the Phillips curve. And people think that maybe if you include real estate, that's how the Phillips curve operates. But anyways, the point is, next slide, please. Conclusion. What's left of monetary policy? What's left of mainstream monetary policy, right? So the first critique, the mainstream model is in disarray. And I think, to be honest, I think central bankers know this to some degree. I think that they know that, consumption and investment are insensitive. They've got people doing research on that. They do. And so they must know the limitations of monetary policy. Now, if they do, why do they still pursue it? And I think this is where the political economy perspective comes in. Yes, this is where the political economy comes in, that if they know their model is limited, why do they still pursue it? And I think this is going back to Jerry Epstein's quote about finance-colored lenses and being dependent on finance. And this is exactly where Veblen and Polanyi come in. You know, next slide, please. On new thinking. You know, we have to sort of broaden up and explore and expose monetary policy, and we can't do that within the confines of economics. We got to go beyond economics. You know, Keynes has this quote where he says the economist has to be part mathematician, part philosopher, part political scientist, part historian. And I think that this is what we need to do. And the first thing that we need to do is to remember that interest rates have a dual nature. They're not just the cost of borrowing, but they're also a revenue, right? They are a revenue on assets, on bonds, on government bonds. And when the central bank changes the interest rate, it influences the rate of interest on bonds, such that these bond holders, they get a revenue from simply holding bonds, what Veblen called a permanent source of free income. Now, Veblen talks about free income because he's talking about what we would call non-productive capital. Right? And Veblen continues, the vested interest, right, these bondholders, who derive an income from the established order of ownership and privilege, and who are essentially held a prescriptive right to get something for nothing. And if you consider the dual nature of interest rates, and if you look at interest rates as an income from holding bonds, from certain financial assets, then you are talking about income distribution. You're talking about the share of rent versus the share of wages. And so therefore you're starting to see interest rates as as a source of conflict. And that in itself challenges the use of fine-tuning. It places conflict at the heart of monetary policy, and also the concept of power, right? And so, next slide, please. This is from an article that was published in Spanish originally, that I presented at the Central Bank of Argentina in 2021, and the English version is coming out in one of the books I'm doing on central banks. And so you can see here the income and wealth distributive effects of monetary policy. And you have this income channel, which is the rate of interest going up. And the direct mechanism is that it influences the income of financial asset holders. And on the other hand, it may have an indirect impact on labor markets if you raise interest rates high enough on unemployment, on wages, and therefore on the wage share. So whereas the direct mechanism deals with the relationship between asset holders asset holders, for example, primarily asset holders, here the indirect effect really concerns workers, right? And then finally, change of interest may have a wealth effect because it may have an influence on financial markets, may lead to asset bubbles, right? So, and all of these may have an impact on aggregate demand, right? But it is an indirect way of having an impact. It's through income, the impact of income distribution on aggregate demand. Next slide, please, labeled inflation. So as I said, why are central banks fighting inflation? I think that to understand that, you have to also understand the dual nature, the dual conflict nature of inflation. Inflation itself is the result of conflict over the appropriate share of income between workers and productive capital. And at the same time, inflation is also at the heart of the conflict among central classes, social classes, about the value of assets versus the value of debt. So there's a lot of conflict when it comes to inflation. And by fighting inflation, you're essentially protecting the interest of wealth holders. I've said this before. Mario Sequeira has a good little paper called something on the vested interest. And he says public institutions are captured by representatives of social classes in order to promote particular interests. And I think that this is how we have to understand monetary policy. So it's a lot more complicated. And so if that's the case, next slide, please. The political economy view is not so mechanical, but it relies on a certain number of biases embedded in monetary policy that I'll get to in the next slide. But, this idea of central banks being captured by vested interests, is shared, Jerry Epstein, for example, has said something on that. This is, the idea of the contested terrain, an approach that is applied to the analysis of central banking, but borrowed from the work of Richard Edwards. Great book in 1979 over the fight over corporate labor processes. But even Tom Pally has recently said that central bank independence is a charade aimed at facilitating control over central banks by financial interests. This has to do about power, the power of finance, the discrimination done at the hands of financial players, and then the special interests, the vested interests. So this is sort of what has become of central banks. And, I'm not in the habit of quoting Milton Friedman to defend my views, but Friedman wrote a phenomenal paper quite some time ago against central bank independence. This is what Friedman was warning us about. Milton Friedman was warning us about central banks would be dependent on financial interests. He was always against the idea of central banks independence, and this is why Friedman was pushing for a monetary rule. He wanted to impose shackles on central bankers, precisely because he was afraid that central banks would be not as much influenced by government, though that does bring up, but he does mention financial interests as well. And so, next slide, please, called inherent biases. And so in the last couple of years, I've been really looking at monetary policy and income and a variety of biases. This is the paper that I presented in Mexico earlier in 2021. It's coming out in a book over there. And what I do in there is I look at monetary policy and its effect on income distribution. And I think that, you know, even the mainstream now admits that there are income distributive consequences. And I've got quotes from, you know, Benoit Cœuré, who was the second in command of the ECB, and from, you know, Draghi, and from a bunch of very important, you know, mainstreamers. So I think that there is this idea, and especially after, so all this research in central banking on income distribution arises out of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 with quantitative easing. And I think that it was made very apparent at that time that with interest rates being near zero and the revenue of rentiers having dried up, central banks decided to engage in a massive quantitative easing or asset purchases, which essentially brought up the value of financial assets. So they went from, you know, defending rentier income to defending rentier wealth, and this was very obvious. And I think that a lot of central bankers now readily admits that. Lots of empirical work on that. But, you know, because they are trapped in this concept of long-run neutrality, they are quick to say, yes, but these are short-term effects. These are short-term impacts. And so therefore, income distribution, it happens from the perspective of monetary policy, but they're temporary, right? Which is the definition of short run. So they have no long run impact because monetary policy is neutral in the long run. And this is where post-Keynesians differ. Certainly my research and others have talked about, you know, monetary policy being a long run incomes policy on the backs of workers. So there are long run effects. And in that sense, monetary policy is class biased. Well, you know, this goes hand in hand with the whole argument of the contested terrain and, you know, finance colored lenses, central banks being captured by financial interests. And so there is a very important class bias, and in fact, to the point of being structural, you know. So there's definitely class bias involved. And then if you start scratching below the surface, you realize that there's not only a class bias, but there's also a gender bias, and maybe even a race bias, undoubtedly a race bias. And that monetary policy will affect men differently than women, white people differently than black people or indigenous people. And so you could say that there are these, right, there's an inherent gender and race bias within monetary policy. And, you know, I'm starting a 3-year research program on these two elements that we're going to look at over the next 3 years empirically, and hopefully publish a number of papers on it. And finally, we have to talk about the environment and how central banking and monetary policy may have a carbon bias. You know, in two ways. First of all, do low interest rates encourage carbon-intensive industries? And that's an empirical question that needs to be looked at. But there's another way that looks at this relationship, is whether the environment, whether climate change, how it affects the economy, risks, does that have an impact on how monetary policy is conducted? So these are questions that need to be explored more fully. And you can't do that if you are strictly looking at monetary policy from the perspective of economics. You got to go beyond economics, and you have to look at social classes, and you have to look at gender, and you have to look at all of these elements, and you have to embed central banks within society, and you have to look at power and how power is exercised. And only then can you start getting a more complete view of central banking. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louis-Philippe. Now we are waiting for. Oh, do you hear double voice?
No, I hear nothing. I just saw a little message by Maxine.
Okay. Okay, maybe no. So we are waiting for comments, for questions from our audience. So just raise your hand or just unmute your. Yeah, Andrzej, you're first.
Hello, my name is Andrzej Carlos. Thank you, Mr. Rochon, for extremely interesting, fascinating, captivating lecture. I couldn't be happier to hear what you already said. I always thought that political economy is this theoretical underpinning of the operation of the real markets that need to be taken into consideration. Well, my question is, from what I understood from your text and from the lecture, is that actually the problem is that the central bank serves as a political agent that works for the interest of some particular groups. For example, the rentier capitalists or the asset holders. Okay, so the problem is that all those operations, for example, the Volcker operation in the 1979, where he raised the interest rate, was actually in order to contain the inflation and to boost the interest of the capital owners. My question would be, because it's not only the question of heterodox economics. It's not only the question of change of the theoretical paradigm of thinking about central banking. What kind of political agent would be able to challenge this kind of dominance of the central banks? Because it kind of, for me, the situation in Europe, and I think in United States as well, in many countries, is that we see the wave of populism, which is kind of a garbled response to this kind of dictate of those class politics, I would say, and I don't know. What do you see any answers? What kind of political agent or political parties, or should we replace central banking? What to do with that? Because there is a growing response and growing negativity towards this framework and operations of the central bank.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I had this conversation recently with Mario Sicchereccia, and he believes that it really is David and Goliath question, and he believes that we should, as a first step, at least fight for a dual mandate of central banks. That would be, where central banks accept responsibility for full employment. And so what that would mean is, central banks may not raise interest rates so quickly, which is what flexible, but, even flexible inflation targeting, Powell in the United States is threatening to raise interest rates very soon.
Yeah.
So it's not flexible. It's, they may raise it in April instead of having it raised in December. It buys us a couple of months. That's what flexible is. I am, I think, more radical than that. I would like to have interest rates just where they are now on a permanent basis, and then just use regulations to prevent bubbles, to prevent, financial markets can do anything they want right now. And so Mario thinks that that's even less, central banks will never agree to that. But, if we elected a political party that instills the right governor, that is independent, you could see a political party appointing someone that would enable these policies. The problem is now that if a central bank decides to keep interest rates at near the lower bound when everyone else in the world has interest rates at 3 or 4%, you're going to have massive devaluations of the exchange rate, and then do we need to talk about capital control? So it's complicated. I understand your question. I don't know what the answer is.
I understand. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's a massive question. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Massive question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But
Michał?
but in the end, Andre, what the conclusion is that workers have to accept whatever little crumbs of cake finance gives us, and we should shut up and be happy that we have a job. If you want to be ironic, that is really what it means. Yeah.
I understand.
Because here you are, Powell is going to start raising interest rates, and we know interest rates are not going to go up one or twice. They're going to go up 10 times over the next couple of years. And that's going to eventually collapse the market. So we're saying, and this is an old question. We're fine with collapsing the economy. We're fine by creating unemployment. We're fine by, people losing jobs, losing their houses. But hey, as long as the price of bread remains at $1, society gains, society wins. I don't believe that, but anyways.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Michał, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you for the lecture. It was a pleasure to listen to you. There's a passing remark you've made that I wanted to refer to, because you've asked the question: was there any relationship between was the Phillips curve ever elastic, so to speak? So. And that's one thing, and I think I could ask you if you think that may be a good point to start with. There's an idea I have from a master's thesis to put that point where the elasticity of the Phillips curve ended at the moment of the Volcker shock, and I believe. There's a very strong correlation between the Volcker shock and the 20-point interest rate in 1979, alongside the fact that the minimum wage in the United States has not moved considerably since that period, and the fact that influenced the lowering of the working class. Their ability to negotiate high wages, and that may have caused the Phillips curve to basically stop working as intended.
Maybe I won't pronounce myself on whether there ever was a Phillips curve relationship. I know that Robert Gordon, has questioned whether there ever was a Phillips curve. And I think that but yeah, you're probably right. I think the collapse probably is about around Volcker for sure. And I think that, because at that time you also have the oppression of workers, wages being deflated for, the past 40 years. And so essentially you've had unemployment go up and down, with no impact on wages or the wage share or whatever you want to call it. So I think that has contributed enormously to flattening the Phillips curve. Yeah, the collapse of unionization is also an important factor. If you look at some data, you can see definitely a relationship on a country basis, on a per country basis, between the decline of unionization and wage increases. So I think that has certainly contributed to it as well. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Magdalena Popowska, yes.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for your lecture. I wanted to ask you a question regarding the last claim, or maybe recommendation, because you said that we should to some extent be interested or research on the central bank policies in relation with gender, maybe with some society classes, and also you mentioned climate change. Yeah, so what environment is doing right now, natural environment, and what we can do with that. So my question is regarding this last element, is this really already kind of trend in economic research? I'm more in management, so that's why it's the question. I was never looking for information on that. Is it already existing trend? You can see researchers interested in the central bank policies worldwide in connection to the climate change?
Well, there is a lot there. Yeah, so it's a recent interest. There's a lot of interest in it. It is sort of going up, but I think that from a mainstream perspective, the conclusion is that the impact is short run on the environment. I had a quote, I think in the paper I sent you. Let me try to find it real fast. Central banking, I think, is on the future. Yeah, it's in that one. And I have a quote in here, and I'm gonna, if I don't find it, then I don't find it. But it's a quote that says specifically that the impact of monetary policy on the environment is short-lived. And again, this is the long-run neutrality of money, that they're constrained by that idea. They cannot accept that monetary policy will have long-run effect. So yeah, I can't find I can't even remember where I use it. But yeah, again, research is being done. Research is being done on income distribution, on gender. But again, it's confronted with the constraint of long-run neutrality. And what that means is, if you believe that something is short-lived, I'm more familiar with the literature on income distribution, for example, where they use words like it's only the result of good policy. So following an inflation targeting will have inevitable bad policy, but it's only short-lived. And if it's short-lived, you can ignore it. Right? I mean, if your model brings you back to your equilibrium, right, as your center of gravitation, then anything that happens in the short run can be ignored. So if you're a central banker, you don't need to consider income distribution. You don't need to consider gender. You don't need to think about the environment. These are all short run effects. They'll disappear. So fine. You conduct monetary policy as if there's nothing to worry about. And I think that this is the contribution that post-Keynesians can make to argue that they're not short run. They're structural. They can have important, lasting effects. Because, the expression class bias involves, brings up issues of long run impact, right? So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Someone had a question on fiscal policy. And so to go back to the first question, what you do, I'm a Keynesian, I'm a Kalekian. I believe in fiscal policy. So, we have to have some sort of better mix of policies, but the mix is, sort of a permanent policy of low interest rates mixed up with, some activists' fiscal policy. And if interest rates are low, the debt burden, the interest burden on the debt, public debt is lower, you can manage it. Everything sort of works out. The question is, who do you have to convince to minimize monetary policy? That's the trick.
Okay. Do we have more questions, comments? So let me just ask my, I hope, simple question. Is maybe fighting with inflation more ethical issue than economic?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you have to convince me what the economic impact of inflation is. We're not talking about 20%. We're not talking about a hyperinflation. We're talking about, in the United States, 7%. Is it that much of an economic problem? Does 7% distort markets? Does 7% create really a burden on households? And don't and remember how inflation is calculated. That it's a basket of various goods, and whereas bread may go up, TV might go down, price of computers may go down, price of cars, and so depending on what your consumption bundle is, you may feel the effect of inflation more or less. But even then, in the aggregate, I don't know if, if inflation was, if everything in the economy, the price of everything remained stable, but the price of big screen televisions went up, who cares? So we don't buy a TV screen. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have an impact on workers. But it depends, you have to convince me, yes, what the economic impact on workers is. And I think that, yes, people might spend more on groceries. But I think it's more of an ethical problem. I think it's, because I see inflation as the result of conflict. And this is how I think we have to see it. And if it's a conflict, then you get into ethical questions.
Okay. This is maybe great summary of our seminar. So let me just finish it. Thank you very much, Louis-Philippe Rochon, for coming from presentation. Thank you all for questions, for discussion. See you next time.
Thank you very much for having me. Bye-bye, everyone.